a powerful British parliamentarian, a notorious KGB superspy. The secret gay liaison between Tom Driberg and Guy Burgess was not merely a slap in the face to a suffocatingly conservative British society. It was the perfect cover for one of the most earth-shattering espionage scandals in history. How did the web of lies spun by these two men manage to completely blindside the entire Western establishment? This stifling domestic life was merely a microcosm of the broader British society. Beneath the surface of Edwardian respectability lay a brutal legal and social code designed to crush deviation. For a boy who would soon recognize his own homosexuality, this world was inherently hostile. The shadow of the late 19th century moral panics loomed large. The Labouchere Amendment of 1885, which criminalized all homosexual acts under the vague guise of gross indecency, remained firmly in place. It was the very same law that had been used to destroy Oscar Wilde, sending a chilling, permanent message to the British public. The destruction of Wilde was a cultural trauma that taught an entire generation of gay men a vital, life-saving lesson. The establishment would not hesitate to annihilate you, regardless of your talent or social standing, if your secret became public. From a young age, Driberg understood that survival depended on deception. He constructed a facade of acceptable eccentricity to navigate a society that actively sought to imprison men like him. His formal education at Lancing College, rather than breaking him, provided a unique theological framework through Anglo-Catholic rituals that allowed him to process his own contradictions. Anglo-Catholicism, with its emphasis on the beauty of the liturgy, the profound grace of the sacraments, and the forgiveness of human frailty, offered Driberg something he desperately needed: a sense of spiritual belonging that did not demand his complete psychological destruction. It appealed to his innate sense of theatricality and his deep appreciation for history and ritual. More importantly, it provided a theological framework that allowed him to process his own contradictions. He could be a sinner in the eyes of the law, a criminal who frequented the shadows, while still remaining a devoted child of God in the eyes of the Church. This intense religious devotion was not a phase, it was a lifelong commitment. He remained a dedicated Anglo-Catholic until the day he died, regularly attending Mass and seeking solace in the rituals of the Church, even as his political and personal lives descended into radicalism and danger. This stark contrast between the sacred and the profane became the defining characteristic of his existence, a dual reality that he inhabited with astonishing ease. Leaving the disciplined environment of Lancing, Driberg matriculated at Christ Church, one of the most elite and aristocratic colleges within Oxford University. The Oxford of the 1920s was a world entirely unto itself. It was the era famously documented in contemporary literature, a time of glittering decadence, intellectual snobbery, and a frantic desire to forget the horrors of the First World War. The university was populated by wealthy heirs, aspiring politicians, and a vibrant, rebellious literary avant-garde. Upon arriving at Christ Church, Driberg threw himself into this intoxicating environment. He was determined to make a name for himself, not through academic diligence, but through sheer force of personality and cultural relevance. He desperately wanted to be recognized as a poet. He gravitated towards the aesthetic circles, seeking the company of the brightest and most eccentric minds of his generation. He mingled with the elite intellectual crowd, attempting to match their intellectual ferocity and literary output. He spent his days engaged in endless debates about modernism, politics, and art, and his nights navigating the complex, often underground sexual networks of the university. He cultivated an air of sophisticated detachment, wearing the finest clothes he could afford, and adopting a manner that was both charming and deeply cynical. He recognized early on that at Oxford, who you knew was often far more important than what you knew. He built a vast, intricate network of contacts, befriending individuals who would later rise to the highest echelons of British politics, literature, and intelligence. However, Beneath the carefully constructed persona of the brilliant young poet, a harsh reality was taking shape. Despite his relentless networking and his desperate ambition, his poetry was profoundly mediocre. It lacked the raw, innovative spark that defined the work of his more talented peers. His verses were derivative, overly constructed, and lacked authentic emotional resonance. The realization that he did not possess the genius required to succeed in the highly competitive world of English literature was a devastating blow to his ego. It forced him to confront the limitations of his own abilities and the hollow nature of his academic pursuits. Simultaneously, his academic standing at Christ Church was rapidly deteriorating. He showed little interest in the rigorous demands of his syllabus, preferring to dedicate his time to political activism and social climbing. The General Strike of 1926 proved to be a watershed moment in his development. As millions of workers across Britain walked out in protest of falling wages and horrific working conditions, the country ground to a halt. While many of his aristocratic peers at Oxford viewed the striking miners with disdain, occasionally even volunteering to break the strike, Driberg found himself profoundly moved by the plight of the working class. His inherent resentment toward the rigid, unforgiving establishment that criminalized his existence began to morph into a coherent political ideology. He began to drift leftward, drawn to the radical promises of socialism and communism. The British Communist Party, which advocated for the complete dismantling of the class system and the overthrow of the capitalist order, offered a radical alternative to the society he so deeply despised. His increasing involvement in radical politics, combined with his total neglect of his academic responsibilities, eventually pushed the university authorities past their breaking point. After years of poor performance and disruptive behavior, he left Oxford University without a degree. This was a catastrophic failure by the standards of his class. To leave Christ Church empty-handed was to burn a significant bridge to traditional success. The established, respectable professions of law, medicine, or the civil service were now effectively closed off to him. His family, deeply embarrassed by his failure and his increasingly erratic behavior, viewed him as a profound disappointment. He found himself adrift in London during the late 1920s, a young man with a disgraced academic record, a criminalized sexual identity, and no clear path forward. The safety net of the elite educational system had vanished, leaving him exposed to the harsh economic realities of the era. He was armed with nothing but his sharp intellect, his biting wit, and a vast, sprawling network of high society contacts. The traditional world had rejected him, and in turn, he was beginning to reject the traditional world. The failure at Oxford, rather than destroying him, stripped away the illusions of an easy, respectable life. It forced him to become ruthless, adaptable, and relentlessly observant. In the years immediately following his departure from Oxford, London was a city of stark, violent contrasts. The economic devastation of the looming Great Depression was beginning to cast a long, dark shadow over the working-class districts, while the aristocracy continued to cling desperately to the opulent lifestyle of the dying Jazz Age. Driberg inhabited the very fault line of these two colliding worlds. By day, he explored the grim realities of urban poverty, his left-wing political convictions hardening into absolute certainties. He attended clandestine political meetings, listening to fiery speeches about the inevitable collapse of capitalism and the necessity of a workers' revolution. The Communist Party provided him with a sense of purpose and a rigid ideological structure that mirrored the religious dogma he so deeply craved. It was a space where his intense intellectual anger could be directed toward a tangible enemy, the ruling class. Yet, by night, he slipped seamlessly back into the world of the elite. He was a frequent guest at the lavish parties in Mayfair and Belgravia, utilizing his impeccable manners and his biting conversational skills to secure free meals and endless streams of alcohol. He was a master of the social masquerade, playing the role of the charming, slightly dangerous eccentric. The very people who invited him into their homes, pouring him expensive champagne and laughing at his devastating critiques of their peers, were the exact same people he was politically plotting to destroy. This dual existence required an extraordinary level of psychological compartmentalization. He was constantly analyzing his hosts, noting their indiscretions, their financial troubles, and their hidden vices. Every social interaction was a gathering of intelligence. He was building a mental archive of the establishment vulnerabilities, an archive that would soon become the foundation of his revolutionary approach to journalism. Furthermore, the London underworld provided an entirely different kind of education. In an era when being caught in a homosexual act meant total ruin, the gay subculture of the city was forced completely underground, existing in a perilous twilight zone of illicit clubs, dimly lit parks, and public lavatories. Navigating this world required immense courage, constant vigilance, and a willingness to embrace absolute risk. Driberg thrived in this environment. The danger was not a deterrent, it was an intoxicant. He courted arrest with a terrifying casualness, trusting in his own arrogance and his upper-class accent to talk his way out of trouble. This constant proximity to ruin forged an ironclad nerve within him. He learned how to operate under extreme psychological pressure, how to manipulate authority figures, and how to weaponize his own vulnerabilities. By the time he stood on the precipice of his journalistic career in the early 1930s, he was no longer the failed, insecure poet of his Oxford days. He was a hardened, highly observant, and utterly fearless operator, fully prepared to take the British establishment by the throat. The transition from a disgraced Oxford dropout to a formidable presence on Fleet Street was an act of sheer, calculated reinvention. By 1933, the British press was a colossus, a fiercely competitive industry dominated by deeply partisan newspapers and powerful press barons. The undisputed master of this domain was Max Aitken, known to the world as Lord Beaverbrook. Beaverbrook was a ruthless, brilliant Canadian magnate who had transformed the Daily Express into a right-wing, populist juggernaut. He was a champion of empire and free enterprise, a man who used his newspaper to make and break politicians. It was an environment that seemed entirely antithetical to a committed communist and a radical outsider. Yet Beaverbrook possessed a predatory instinct for identifying raw, unconventional talent, and he recognized something exceptionally dangerous and highly marketable in Thomas Driberg. Driberg entered the Daily Express initially on a trial basis, operating as a junior reporter and feature writer. He was immediately thrust into the chaotic, smoke-filled newsrooms of 1930s London, forced to learn the mechanics of mass communication under immense pressure. He quickly realized that traditional political reporting was rigid and heavily censored by convention. To truly wield influence, he needed a different vehicle. He found it in the social diary. Before Driberg, newspaper gossip columns were largely sycophantic lists of who attended which aristocratic ball, written with a deferential tone to appease the upper classes. Driberg saw an opportunity to weaponize the format. Under the direct patronage of Beaverbrook, he took over a struggling column and completely reinvented it under the pseudonym William Hickey. This change of authorship sparked a revolution in British journalism. The William Hickey column became a daily, forensic examination of the British establishment, written from the inside but laced with a lethal, left-wing critique. Driberg used the access granted by his upper-class background to infiltrate the most exclusive dining rooms, private clubs, and country estates in the country. He would drink champagne with dukes, conservative ministers, and wealthy industrialists, listening carefully to their unguarded conversations. The very next morning, millions of working-class readers would open the Daily Express to find the hypocrisy, the extravagance, and the political blunders of the elite laid bare on the page. The brilliance of the William Hickey persona was its tone. Driberg perfected a voice that was cool, detached, and relentlessly observant. He avoided overt left-wing preaching, knowing that Beaverbrook would never tolerate a communist manifesto in his flagship conservative paper. Instead, he utilized juxtaposition and irony. He would describe the sickening opulence of a Mayfair banquet in excruciating detail, and then, in the very next paragraph, provide a stark factual account of a hunger march by unemployed miners in Wales. He let the contrasting facts speak for themselves, subtly radicalizing a vast readership without ever violating the formal rules of his employment. This arrangement created one of the most fascinating paradoxes of the era. Lord Beaverbrook, the ultimate capitalist press baron, was paying a massive salary to a card-carrying member of the Communist Party to mock the very establishment Beaverbrook sought to protect. The magnate tolerated this blatant ideological sabotage for one simple reason. Driberg was exceptionally good at his job, and the William Hickey columns sold an astronomical number of newspapers. Beaverbrook respected power and circulation above all else, and he viewed his eccentric, radical columnist as a prized, highly profitable asset. This relationship taught Driberg a crucial lesson about the British elite. He realized that the establishment was not a monolithic fortress of ideology. It was entirely transactional. As long as you were useful, entertaining, or profitable, your sins and your radicalism would be ignored. Throughout the 1930s, the William Hickey column became a vital chronicle of a world sliding inevitably toward war. Driberg did not confine himself to London society. He traveled extensively, acting as a foreign correspondent disguised as a social diarist. He recognized the rising threat of fascism far earlier than many of his conservative contemporaries. While the British government pursued a policy of appeasement toward Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, Driberg was using his platform to sound the alarm. He reported from Germany, noting the terrifying efficiency of the Nazi state and the brutal suppression of dissent. He traveled to Spain during the Spanish Civil War, reporting from the front lines of the conflict between the Republican forces and Francisco Franco's fascist rebellion. These experiences profoundly deepened his radicalism. He witnessed firsthand the violent realities of global political struggle, stripping away any lingering romanticism about revolution. The Spanish Civil War, in particular, was a defining moment for his generation of left-wing intellectuals. It solidified his belief that the traditional British establishment, with its deep-seated anti-communism, was secretly sympathetic to the fascist cause. This conviction justified his continued clandestine relationship with the Communist Party, even as he ascended to the highest ranks of mainstream journalism. He operated as a mole in plain sight, using the resources of a conservative empire to gather intelligence and shape public opinion against the interests of his employers. However, the immense psychological strain of maintaining this elaborate triple life began to take a toll. He was a daily columnist, a secret political radical, and a gay man operating in a highly dangerous, criminalized sexual underworld. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 fundamentally altered the landscape of British society. The national focus shifted to total mobilization, and the trivialities of high society gossip became entirely obsolete. Driberg adapted, shifting the focus of the William Hickey column to the daily struggles of the British public, enduring the Blitz, the realities of rationing, and the incompetence of certain military and political leaders. His writing became sharper, more directly political, and increasingly critical of the conservative government leadership. By 1943, the tension between his radical politics and the conservative mandate of the Daily Express became unsustainable. The precise details of his departure remain layered in conflicting accounts, but the fundamental reality was a profound ideological rupture. He left the massive platform of the Beaverbrook empire and transitioned to a publication that openly aligned with his political convictions. He joined Reynolds News, a Sunday newspaper owned by the Cooperative Press. Moving to Reynolds News was a significant professional risk, taking him away from the massive mainstream circulation of the Express. Yet, it offered him complete editorial freedom. He was no longer required to hide his socialism behind a mask of detached irony. He became a leading voice of the British left, writing blistering political commentary that openly advocated for a radical restructuring of the post-war economy, the nationalization of major industries, and the dismantling of the British Empire. His column became essential reading for trade unionists, radical intellectuals, and the growing faction of left-wing politicians who were preparing to challenge the conservative wartime coalition. This period of journalistic independence also allowed him to expand his writing beyond the daily grind of the news cycle. Driberg possessed a deep fascination with the mechanics of power and the psychology of the men who wielded it. He channeled this interest into biographical writing, seeking to dissect the lives of the individuals who had shaped his era. He eventually published a highly complex, unauthorized biography of his former employer, Lord Beaverbrook. The book was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive journalism. It praised Beaverbrook's immense energy and organizational genius while ruthlessly exposing his vindictive nature, his political inconsistencies, and his fundamentally transactional view of human relationships. It was a calculated act of intellectual patricide, cementing Driberg's reputation as a writer who was unafraid to attack the most powerful figures in the country. Even more significant was his later biographical work on his close friend, Guy Burgess. While this book would not be published until after the devastating espionage scandals of the 1950s, the groundwork for it was laid during his years as a journalist. Driberg had always been drawn to damaged, brilliant, and morally ambiguous individuals. He understood the psychological architecture of the outsider, the man who was forced to lie to survive. His journalistic career served as an extensive, decades-long study of human deception, political hypocrisy, and the fragile, often corrupt nature of the British establishment. He had learned how to extract secrets from the powerful, how to manipulate narratives, and how to survive in hostile territory. These were the precise skills he would soon require as he stepped out of the newsroom and directly onto the floor of the House of Commons. The year 1942 marked a profound turning point, not just in the global theater of the Second World War, but in the internal political mechanics of the British state. The country was exhausted. The initial adrenaline of the Blitz had faded into a grinding, bureaucratic reality of rationing, military setbacks, and relentless industrial labor. The political landscape was artificially frozen by a wartime electoral truce. The major political parties, Conservative, Labour, and Liberal, had agreed not to contest parliamentary by-elections against each other, essentially guaranteeing that whoever held a seat when they died or retired would be replaced by a member of the same party. This truce created a stagnant political environment, frustrating a populace that was increasingly critical of the Conservative government leadership and desperate for radical post-war change. Thomas Driberg recognized this stagnation as an unprecedented opportunity. A vacancy arose in the parliamentary constituency of Malden, a predominantly rural and agricultural district in Essex. Historically, Malden was a conservative stronghold, populated by farmers, fishermen, and traditional rural workers. On paper, it was the absolute last place one would expect a radical, left-wing, urban journalist to find political success. Yet, Driberg possessed an acute understanding of the public mood. He knew that the voters were not necessarily attached to conservative ideology. They were simply ignored by the political establishment. He entered the Malden by-election as an independent candidate, circumventing the party truce and offering the voters a direct channel to express their wartime frustrations. His campaign was a masterpiece of political insurgency. He stripped away the persona of the London socialite and engaged directly with the harsh realities of rural life. He utilized his extensive journalistic platform and his deep understanding of mass communication to bypass traditional political gatekeeping. Abandoning abstract communist theory, he campaigned relentlessly on immediate, tangible issues: the demand for better agricultural wages, the exposure of inefficiencies in the wartime supply chains, and the urgent need for better housing for rural laborers. He also tapped into a growing, albeit controversial, sentiment among the British working class by loudly demanding the opening of a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure on the Soviet Union. This aligned perfectly with his own covert communist sympathies, but he framed it purely as a necessary military strategy to shorten the war and bring British soldiers home. The conservative establishment viewed his candidacy as an irritating joke, entirely underestimating his sheer organizational stamina and the deep reservoir of public anger. When the votes were counted in June 1942, the result sent a shockwave through the halls of Westminster. Driberg won a crushing victory, defeating the official conservative candidate by a massive margin. It was a humiliating blow to the government and a clear signal that the political consensus was beginning to fracture. Entering the House of Commons, Driberg was a dangerous anomaly. He was an independent with no formal party whip to constrain him, armed with a daily newspaper column that he used to amplify his parliamentary speeches. He immediately established himself as a relentless critic of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, attacking the government on issues of civil liberties, the treatment of colonial subjects, and the post-war planning. He was a spectacular orator, utilizing a cold, clinical precision to dissect government policy. He understood that the House of Commons was a theater, and he played the role of the righteous outsider to perfection. However, Driberg was fundamentally a political pragmatist. As the end of the war approached, he recognized that remaining an independent would ultimately isolate him from the true levers of power. To enact the sweeping social changes he desired, he needed to align himself with the machinery of a major party. In 1945, just as the war in Europe concluded, he formally applied to join the Labour Party. This transition was viewed with intense suspicion by the traditional trade unionists who formed the backbone of the party. They knew of his long-standing ties to the Communist Party and deeply distrusted his upper-class background and his flamboyant lifestyle. Yet, the Labour leadership, recognizing his immense popularity and his utility as a propagandist, approved his membership. The general election of 1945 fundamentally reshaped the British state. The electorate, determined never to return to the poverty and inequality of the 1930s, decisively rejected the Conservatives and delivered a landslide victory for the Labour Party. Clement Attlee, a quiet, unassuming man with a brilliant administrative mind, became Prime Minister. For the first time in history, a socialist government held an absolute majority, armed with a mandate to create the modern welfare state, nationalize major industries, and establish the National Health Service. Driberg found himself at the very center of this political earthquake. He was re-elected in Malden with an increased majority, firmly embedded within the ruling party. His role in the immediate aftermath of the election was vital. The new Labour cabinet was composed of serious, often dour men who lacked the charismatic appeal of their conservative predecessors. Men like Stafford Cripps, an austere, deeply religious architect of economic planning, and Ernest Bevin, the forceful, formidable leader of the Transport Workers' Union, who became Foreign Secretary. These were men of immense substance, but they struggled to communicate their vision to a public exhausted by years of war. Driberg became the unofficial translator for the socialist government. He used his extensive journalistic connections to humanize the new cabinet, writing detailed, compelling profiles that introduced the working-class leaders to the broader public. He framed their austerity not as a punishment, but as a necessary moral crusade to rebuild the nation. He operated as a critical bridge between the radical intelligentsia and the traditional working-class elements of the party. He was everywhere, sitting on crucial policy committees, organizing left-wing factions within the backbenches, and serving as a crucial conduit of information between the Parliament and Fleet Street. Yet, a glaring contradiction emerged. Despite his undeniable brilliance, his massive public profile, and his deep integration into the labor machinery, Driberg was never offered a position within the government. He watched as men with a fraction of his intellect and political instinct were promoted to ministerial roles, while he remained permanently confined to the backbenches. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated quarantine enforced by the highest levels of the British establishment. The leadership of the Labour Party, particularly men like Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin, were fiercely anti-communist. The Cold War was beginning to freeze over Europe, and British intelligence agencies were actively purging Soviet sympathizers from positions of influence. Driberg's background as a former member of the Communist Party, combined with his continued shadowy associations with radical figures across Europe, made him a massive security risk in the eyes of the state. He was simply too dangerous to be allowed near classified government documents or foreign policy decisions. More critically, his private life was considered a ticking time bomb. The political class in Westminster operated on a strict code of omerta regarding the private indiscretions of its members, but Driberg pushed this tolerance to the absolute breaking point. His aggressive pursuit of illegal homosexual encounters in the grimmiest areas of London was widely known among political insiders and the police. The intelligence services, specifically MI5, kept extensive files on his activities. The government leadership knew that if he were elevated to the cabinet, the right-wing press or hostile foreign intelligence agencies could easily destroy the entire government by exposing him. He was politically untouchable. Rather than being broken by this exclusion, Driberg weaponized his independence. Because he owed no loyalty to a ministerial career, he was free to act as the conscience of the radical left. From 1942 to 1955, and again from 1959 to 1974, he dominated the left wing of the Labour Party. He became a master of parliamentary procedure, using his position to torment both conservative governments and moderate labor leaders who he felt were betraying socialist principles. He championed deeply unpopular causes, fighting relentlessly for the rights of colonial subjects in Africa and Asia, demanding an end to capital punishment, and advocating for the decriminalization of homosexuality long before it was politically safe to do so. He was a paradox in a tailored suit. He demanded equality for the working class, but insisted on staying at the finest hotels and eating at the most expensive restaurants. He was a dedicated socialist who reveled in the pomp and ceremony of the British aristocracy. He built a vast power base entirely outside the traditional structures of government, relying on his sheer force of personality, his ruthless intelligence, and his absolute lack of fear. He recognized that true power in Westminster did not always reside in the cabinet room. It could be wielded just as effectively from the shadows of the backbenches, manipulating the press, threatening rebellions, and forcing the establishment to bend to his will. The suspicion that Thomas Driberg was playing a deeply dangerous, duplicitous game began long before the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union set their sights on him. The earliest fractures in his carefully constructed political facade appeared during his long, complex relationship with the Communist Party of Great Britain. For over 2 decades, he had been a loyal, card-carrying member, operating as a vital asset who could bridge the gap between radical socialist theory and the mainstream British press. He attended clandestine meetings, paid his party dues, and consistently used his massive journalistic platform to subtly advocate for Marxist principles and defend Soviet foreign policy. Yet in the early 1940s, the party abruptly and unceremoniously expelled him. The official reasons provided by the party leadership were predictably bureaucratic. citing ideological deviations and a lack of party discipline. The true motivation, however, was rooted in profound paranoia. The leadership of the British Communist Party, heavily monitored and heavily directed by Moscow, had come to the terrifying conclusion that their star journalist was actually an informant working for MI5, the British domestic counterintelligence agency. They believed he was a mole, a man deliberately planted within their ranks to map their networks, identify their funding sources, and report back to the very establishment he publicly despised. Decades later, declassified intelligence files and historical investigations would vindicate the paranoia of the Communist Party. Driberg had indeed been passing information to MI5 for years. His relationship with British intelligence was a masterpiece of moral ambiguity. The officers of MI5 were overwhelmingly drawn from the conservative upper-class institutions of the British state. They despised everything Driberg publicly stood for: his radical socialism, his attacks on the empire, and his flamboyant disregard for traditional morality. Yet, they were absolute pragmatists. They recognized that Driberg possessed unprecedented access to the most secretive, highly guarded factions of the radical left. He was a trusted insider in circles where a traditional intelligence officer could never hope to penetrate. Driberg did not operate like a traditional spy. He did not steal classified documents or photograph military installations. His currency was far more subtle and often far more devastating. He trafficked in high-level political gossip, character assessments, and the internal factional disputes of the left-wing movement. He provided MI5 with detailed psychological profiles of communist leaders, trade union agitators, and suspected Soviet sympathizers within the media. He understood the complex, shifting alliances of the radical underground, and he fed this intelligence to his handlers in exchange for a quiet, unspoken guarantee of immunity regarding his illegal sexual activities. It was a cold, calculated transaction. He betrayed the secrets of his political comrades to secure his own survival in a society that actively sought to imprison him. As the Second World War ended and the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, the stakes of this double life escalated dramatically. The transition into the Cold War transformed London into a battleground of espionage and paranoia. The threat of Soviet infiltration terrified the British political establishment, a terror that was entirely justified by the eventual unmasking of the Cambridge 5 spy ring. In this atmosphere of hypervigilance, Driberg occupied a uniquely precarious position. He was a prominent Labour member of Parliament, a man who mingled with cabinet ministers and possessed intimate knowledge of British domestic and foreign policy strategies. He was also a former communist with a highly documented history of criminalized sexual behavior and a massive, unwieldy network of shadowy contacts. To foreign intelligence agencies, he was the ultimate target, a powerful man with a fatal, easily exploitable weakness. The inevitable collision between Driberg and the Soviet intelligence apparatus occurred during a journey to Moscow in the 1950s. The Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev was a fortress state completely sealed off from Western influence and heavily policed by the KGB. Every foreign diplomat, journalist, and politician who entered the country was subjected to intense, suffocating surveillance. Their hotel rooms were bugged, their movements were tracked, and their vulnerabilities were meticulously catalogued. A man of Driberg's experience and intelligence should have recognized the extreme danger of his environment. He should have exercised absolute caution, understanding that the KGB would use any available method to compromise a visiting British parliamentarian. Instead, he succumbed entirely to his darkest compulsions. The psychological need for risk that drove him to cruise the dangerous, heavily policed parks of London did not dissipate when he crossed the Iron Curtain. If anything, the oppressive, totalitarian atmosphere of Moscow seemed to heighten his demand for transgression. Ignoring the absolute certainty of KGB surveillance, He ventured out into the freezing streets of the Soviet capital, actively seeking out the underground, highly illegal homosexual networks of the city. He eventually made his way to a public lavatory known to be a cruising ground, a location that the KGB had almost certainly monitored and prepared in advance. The trap was executed with brutal textbook efficiency. As Driberg engaged in a sexual encounter with a local Russian man, the darkness of the lavatory was shattered by the sudden blinding flash of cameras. KGB operatives materialized, securing undeniable photographic evidence of the British Member of Parliament committing an act that was punishable by severe prison sentences in both the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom. It was the classic Cold War honey trap, a flawlessly executed operation designed to absolutely destroy the target's psychological resistance and force their total capitulation. The standard KGB protocol for this situation was highly predictable. The target would be detained, isolated, and confronted with the photographic evidence. The intelligence officers would clearly outline the consequences of refusal. The photographs would be sent directly to the British press, the Prime Minister, and the target family. The resulting scandal would result in immediate public disgrace, the termination of their political career, and highly probable criminal prosecution. Faced with the total annihilation of their lives, the vast majority of men would break instantly, agreeing to become a covert asset for the Kremlin in exchange for the suppression of the evidence. The KGB anticipated that Driberg, a prominent politician with everything to lose, would be easily broken. They fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of the man they had trapped. When confronted by his KGB handlers and presented with the blackmail material, Driberg did not collapse into a state of panic or despair. He did not beg for mercy or attempt to deny the reality of the photographs. Instead, he reacted with a chilling, detached pragmatism that entirely destabilized the Soviet operatives. He treated the confrontation not as the end of his life, but as a complex, high-stakes negotiation. Driberg possessed a psychological armor forged by decades of living under the constant threat of exposure in London. He had faced down British police officers, navigated the treacherous politics of the Labour Party, and survived the brutal, physical realities of the criminal underworld. The threat of ruin was not a new experience for him. It was the baseline reality of his entire adult existence. He looked at the KGB operatives and recognized that their leverage was powerful, but not absolute. He understood that they did not actually want to destroy him. They wanted to use him. By destroying him, they would lose a highly valuable asset placed directly inside the British Parliament. He agreed to their terms. He agreed to provide the Kremlin with inside information regarding the strategies, the internal conflicts, and the policy directions of the British government. He officially became a Soviet asset, a man compromised by blackmail and bound to the KGB. However, the true nature of this arrangement was infinitely more complex than a simple act of treason. Driberg did not become a subservient, terrified puppet of Moscow. He transformed the blackmail into a shield, initiating a spectacular, highly dangerous game of triple espionage. Operating as a KGB asset provided him with a unique form of immunity. He knew that the Soviets would now actively protect his reputation, using their own resources to ensure that his sexual activities and his political indiscretions were never exposed to the Western press. Furthermore, it is highly probable, given his long-standing relationship with British intelligence, that he immediately informed his handlers at MI5 about the KGB honey trap. He likely presented himself as a loyal British citizen who had been compromised but was willing to act as a double agent, feeding disinformation to the Soviets while gathering intelligence on their operational methods and personnel. He became a shadow broker, existing in the lethal microscopic space between the intelligence agencies of the two most powerful blocs on Earth. He fed the KGB carefully curated information, providing them with enough accurate political gossip to maintain his credibility as an asset, while likely withholding critical strategic secrets. Simultaneously, he utilized his connection to the Soviets to enhance his value to MI5, proving that he could penetrate the highest levels of hostile intelligence networks. He weaponized his own vulnerability, turning the criminalized nature of his sexuality into an instrument of geopolitical leverage. It required an almost unfathomable level of arrogance and nerve to believe he could outsmart the combined intelligence apparatus of the Cold War. He was playing a game where a single miscalculation, a single piece of intercepted communication, or a sudden shift in political loyalty would result in his immediate destruction. Yet he thrived in this environment of absolute peril. He returned to London, taking his seat on the green benches of the House of Commons, publicly debating the great moral issues of the day, while secretly managing a network of handlers in both London and Moscow. He was no longer just a politician or a journalist. He was a master manipulator of the global intelligence war, a man who realized that in a world obsessed with secrets, the ultimate power belonged to the man who was entirely unafraid of his own. The landscape of Cold War espionage was fundamentally altered by a group of men whose betrayal struck at the very heart of the British establishment. They were known as the Cambridge Five, a highly sophisticated, deeply embedded ring of Soviet spies who successfully infiltrated the highest echelons of the British intelligence services, the Foreign Office, and the diplomatic corps. These men were not foreign agents or radical outsiders. They were the absolute embodiment of the British elite. They were the sons of the aristocracy and the upper middle class, educated at the finest public schools and groomed at Cambridge University to rule the empire. Their treason was terrifying to the government precisely because it proved that the traditional markers of class and breeding were no longer guarantees of loyalty. The establishment had been hollowed out from the inside by its own privileged children. At the very center of this devastating intelligence catastrophe was Guy Burgess. Among all the figures who operated in the shadowy world of mid-century British treason, Burgess was perhaps the most chaotic, the most brilliant, and the most deeply self-destructive. He possessed a sharp analytical mind that allowed him to maneuver seamlessly through the BBC, the intelligence services, and the Foreign Office. Yet, his personal life was a chaotic storm of extreme alcoholism, chain smoking, and aggressive, reckless homosexuality. He was a man who seemed to lack any internal mechanism for caution, openly boasting about his radical Marxist beliefs in elite gentlemen's clubs, confident that his establishment credentials would protect him from genuine scrutiny. The British ruling class operated on a deeply ingrained assumption that a man who wore the right school tie and spoke with the right accent could not possibly be a Soviet spy. Burgess weaponized this immense structural blind spot with devastating efficiency, stealing thousands of highly classified documents and handing them directly to his KGB handlers. Thomas Driberg and Guy Burgess were essentially two sides of the same counterfeit coin. They were drawn to each other with the magnetic pull of shared secrets and parallel lives. Their friendship was forged in the exclusive dining rooms of London and the shadowy, criminalized sexual underworld they both ruthlessly exploited. They shared a profound cynical understanding of the hypocrisy that governed British society. They both utilized their immense charm, their aristocratic bearing, and their sharp intellects to manipulate a system they secretly despised. They were both radical left-wing ideologues who absolutely refused to abandon the luxurious trappings of the upper class. They would spend evenings engaged in intense, highly theoretical debates about Marxist dialectics and the inevitable collapse of the capitalist system, while drinking expensive champagne paid for by the very establishment they were plotting to dismantle. However, while Driberg played a complex, multi-layered game of survival, balancing his radicalism with his position in Parliament and his covert relationship with MI5, Burgess possessed no such equilibrium. Burgess was a true fanatic, a man entirely committed to the Soviet cause, regardless of the personal cost. As the late 1940s bled into the early 1950s, the tightening grip of the Cold War and the aggressive counterintelligence efforts of the United States began to close the net around the Cambridge spy ring. American and British intelligence agencies, utilizing decrypted Soviet cables from the Venona project, were slowly but inevitably zeroing in on a highly placed Soviet asset within the British Foreign Office. That asset was Donald Maclean, another core member of the Cambridge Five and a close associate of Burgess. The events of May 1951 shattered the illusion of British intelligence supremacy and sent a wave of absolute panic through the government. Realizing that Maclean was on the verge of being arrested and interrogated, the KGB activated a desperate extraction plan. Burgess, whose own cover was beginning to fray under the weight of his erratic behavior, was tasked with facilitating Maclean's escape. In a sequence of events that remains heavily scrutinized by historians, Burgess did not simply help his comrade flee, he chose to run with him. On a Friday evening, the two men boarded a cross-channel ferry to France, disappearing entirely from the radar of Western intelligence. They vanished behind the Iron Curtain, surfacing in the Soviet Union as the most high-profile defectors of the era. The defection of Burgess and Maclean was a catastrophic humiliation for the United Kingdom. It decimated the trust between London and Washington, leading the American intelligence establishment to view their British counterparts with deep, lasting suspicion. At home, it triggered a ruthless, sweeping witch hunt within the civil service, the media, and the political class. MI5 and the Special Branch launched a frantic investigation, tearing through the social and professional networks of the two defectors, desperately searching for the remaining members of the spy ring and anyone who might have facilitated their escape. Hundreds of individuals were interrogated, careers were abruptly terminated on mere suspicion, and a climate of intense paranoia gripped the capital. Given his deep, highly visible friendship with Guy Burgess, Thomas Driberg was immediately thrust into the center of this storm. His name was heavily featured in the address books and social diaries left behind by the defectors. To the external observer, Driberg appeared to be in a position of terminal danger. He was a former communist, a known homosexual in an era when homosexuality was viewed by the security services as a massive blackmail risk, and he was the intimate confidant of the most notorious traitor in modern British history. By all conventional logic, the defection of Burgess should have resulted in the immediate destruction of Driberg's political career and a severe, hostile investigation into his own loyalties. Yet, once again, the invisible architecture of his survival mechanisms protected him. While lesser politicians and civil servants were purged for having passing associations with Burgess, Driberg remained entirely untouched. He faced no public inquiry, he was not forced to resign his parliamentary seat, and he continued to operate at the highest levels of the Labour Party. This astonishing immunity points directly to the sheer complexity of his relationship with MI5. The British intelligence services knew exactly who Driberg was. They were fully aware of his relationship with Burgess. It is highly probable that MI5 calculated that prosecuting or exposing Driberg would cause far more damage to the government than it would solve. Exposing him would risk revealing their own utilization of him as an informant, and it would trigger a massive political scandal involving the private lives of numerous other high-ranking officials. The establishment closed ranks, prioritizing the preservation of its own structural integrity over the pursuit of absolute justice. Driberg was simply deemed too deeply embedded, too knowledgeable, and too dangerous to be taken down. For 5 years following the defection, Burgess and Maclean remained hidden in the Soviet Union, living in heavily guarded isolation. The British public was left with a vacuum of information, filled only by speculation, anger, and a deep, lingering sense of betrayal. The Soviet government maintained a strict wall of silence, refusing to acknowledge the presence of the defectors or allow them any contact with the Western press. Burgess, a man who had thrived on the social energy and intellectual vibrancy of London, found himself trapped in a bleak, highly controlled environment in Moscow, cut off from everything he knew. The reality of his treason had resulted not in a socialist utopia, but in a gilded, freezing cage. This total blackout ended abruptly in 1956. The political climate within the Soviet Union was experiencing a temporary, highly calculated thaw following the death of Joseph Stalin and the ascension of Nikita Khrushchev. The Kremlin decided that the time had come to utilize their high-profile defectors for a massive propaganda offensive. They wanted to present Burgess and McLean to the world not as desperate fugitives or malicious spies, but as principled, intellectual idealists who had chosen the Soviet system out of a deep moral conviction for world peace. To execute this narrative, they needed a conduit, a Western journalist, who could be trusted to frame the story sympathetically while possessing enough mainstream credibility to ensure it was widely read in Britain. They did not choose a neutral observer. They chose Thomas Driberg. The KGB, fully aware of his deep friendship with Burgess and his own compromised status following their previous blackmail operations against him, recognized him as the perfect instrument. Driberg was approached and offered something that every major newspaper in the world was desperate for: exclusive face-to-face access to Guy Burgess in Moscow. It was an unprecedented journalistic coup, an opportunity to secure the most sought-after interview of the decade. For Driberg, the offer represented a massive professional triumph, but it was also a journey into an intricate, highly dangerous psychological trap. He was preparing to travel deep into hostile territory, to meet a man who had betrayed their country, a man who mirrored his own darkest complexities. He knew that every word they spoke, every interaction they had, would be meticulously monitored and analyzed by Soviet intelligence. He was stepping onto a stage designed by the KGB, armed only with his sharp intellect and his absolute refusal to be intimidated. The stage was set for a reunion that would ultimately produce one of the most controversial, heavily manipulated, and politically explosive biographies of the Cold War era. The 1960s brought a profound cultural and political seismic shift to the United Kingdom, fundamentally altering the landscape in which Thomas Driberg had operated for decades. The rigid, suffocating morality of the post-war era began to fracture under the weight of a new, rebellious generation. The British establishment, which had previously projected an aura of impenetrable dignity, was repeatedly rocked by devastating scandals. The most prominent of these was the Profumo affair in 1963, a catastrophic collision of sex, high politics, and Soviet espionage that severely damaged the conservative government. As the public reeled from the revelations of cabinet ministers sharing mistresses with Soviet naval attachés, Driberg watched from the labor backbenches with a profound, cynical amusement. The establishment was finally being exposed for the hypocrisy he had recognized and exploited his entire life. Yet, as the culture liberalized, Driberg found himself facing a bizarre psychological paradox. For his entire adult life, his identity had been forged in the crucible of absolute resistance. He was a radical socialist in an imperial capitalist system, and he was an actively cruising homosexual in a society that aggressively criminalized such behavior. The danger, the constant threat of arrest, and the necessity of maintaining a highly complex triple life had provided the adrenaline that fueled his existence. However, the political landscape was shifting beneath his feet. In 1967, the Labour government passed the Sexual Offences Act, which partially decriminalized homosexual acts in private between two men over the age of 21. It was a monumental legislative victory for human rights, a cause that Driberg had quietly championed for years. But on a deeply personal level, the change in the law removed the very element of extreme jeopardy that he had always craved. The subterranean, highly policed world of illicit encounters the thrilling game of cat and mouse with the authorities was suddenly stripped of its lethal consequences. For a man who had built his entire psychological architecture around the thrill of transgression, legality felt remarkably dull. As society became more permissive, Driberg, ironically, became more of a relic. He was no longer a dangerous outlaw defying the state. He was simply an aging politician with eccentric tastes. His physical health also began to deteriorate rapidly during this period. The relentless pace of his lifestyle, the heavy drinking, the erratic hours, the immense psychological strain of managing competing intelligence agencies began to take a severe toll. He suffered from chronic health issues, and his sharp, predatory physical presence slowly gave way to a stooped, frail appearance. Despite his declining health, he refused to relinquish his grip on political power. He remained a formidable force within the left wing of the Labour Party, serving as the chairman of the National Executive Committee. He continued to use his position to fiercely debate foreign policy, particularly concerning the escalating conflict in Vietnam and the continued decolonization of Africa. By the early 1970s, it was evident to everyone in Westminster that his time in the House of Commons was drawing to a close. The political leadership of the Labour Party, now firmly under the control of Prime Minister Harold Wilson, viewed Driberg with a mixture of immense respect for his past journalistic triumphs and profound exhaustion regarding his relentless radicalism. Wilson himself was a man plagued by intense paranoia regarding the intelligence services, famously believing that MI5 was actively plotting to destabilize his government. In this atmosphere of suspicion, Driberg was a deeply uncomfortable liability. The government wanted him quietly removed from the active political battlefield, but they knew he possessed far too many secrets to be simply discarded. The solution the establishment devised was a masterpiece of classic British hypocrisy. Rather than investigating his highly suspicious connections to Soviet intelligence or quietly forcing his retirement, the state decided to absorb him. In 1974, Thomas Driberg retired from the House of Commons and was almost immediately elevated to the House of Lords. He was granted a life peerage, taking the title of Baron Bradwell of Bradwell-Juxta-Mare in the county of Essex. The sheer irony of this elevation was staggering. A man who had spent over 40 years actively attempting to dismantle the British class system, a former member of the Communist Party who had ruthlessly mocked the aristocracy in his daily newspaper column, and a highly compromised intelligence asset who had been blackmailed by the KGB, was now draped in ermine robes and granted a seat in the highest, most privileged chamber of the British Parliament. It was the ultimate camouflage. The establishment effectively silenced their most dangerous critic by making him a formal, titled member of the very ruling class he despised. Driberg accepted the peerage without a trace of hesitation. He had always enjoyed the luxurious trappings of power, and he viewed the title not as a defeat, but as a final, magnificent joke played upon a profoundly corrupt system. His time in the House of Lords was brief and largely ceremonial. The fire that had driven his early political insurgency had burned out. He spent his final years living in relative comfort, continuing to attend Anglo-Catholic services and writing his memoirs. He knew that he had successfully outmaneuvered every force that had attempted to destroy him. He had survived the wrath of the Daily Express, the purges of the Communist Party, the aggressive hunting of the London police force, the blackmail of the KGB, and the intense suspicion of MI5. He had played the most dangerous game imaginable, and he had won simply by outlasting his enemies. On the 12th of August, 1976, Thomas Driberg suffered a fatal heart attack while traveling in a taxi in London. He was 71 years old. The immediate public reaction to his death was a predictable chorus of sanitized establishment grief. Newspapers published respectful obituaries, praising his pioneering role in modern journalism and his steadfast commitment to the left wing of the Labour Party. Fellow politicians delivered solemn tributes to his formidable intellect and his parliamentary skills. He was buried with the full, majestic rites of the Anglo-Catholic Church that he had loved so deeply. The political and media elite breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing that the volatile, highly dangerous secrets of Tom Driberg had been safely buried with him. They were entirely wrong. The absolute truth regarding his life could not be contained by a gravestone. Within a few short years of his death, the carefully constructed facade began to collapse. Investigative journalists, freed from the constraints of strict libel laws that protected living politicians, began to dig into his past. In 1981, the journalist Chapman Pincher published a devastating book titled "Their Trade is Treachery," which sent shockwaves through the British establishment. Relying on deep sources within the intelligence community, Pincher publicly alleged for the first time that Driberg had been a long-term agent of the Soviet Union. Subsequent investigations, the release of declassified intelligence files, and the testimonies of former KGB operatives slowly revealed the full, terrifying scope of his activities. The public finally learned the details of the Moscow honey trap, his deliberate manipulation of the Guy Burgess biography, and his complex, duplicitous relationship with MI5. The posthumous revelations destroyed his remaining political reputation. He was no longer remembered as a brilliant, eccentric radical. He was exposed as a ruthless opportunist who had traded state secrets for personal immunity. The historical debate regarding Driberg remains fiercely contested. Some intelligence historians argue that he was a relatively low-level informant, a man who provided the Soviets with high-level political gossip rather than actionable military intelligence. They posit that he was essentially a grifter, playing both sides purely for his own survival and amusement, and that MI5 always knew exactly what he was doing. Others maintain that his position within the ruling party, his intimate access to cabinet ministers, and his ability to shape public opinion made him an incredibly damaging Soviet asset, a man who actively undermined Western security during the most dangerous decades of the Cold War. The life of Thomas Driberg forces a harsh, uncomfortable confrontation with the reality of power and the mechanisms of survival. He was a man composed entirely of contradictions, a devout Christian who embraced the criminal underworld, a socialist who demanded aristocratic luxury, and a British lawmaker who served the intelligence apparatus of a hostile foreign power. But these contradictions were not merely character flaws. They were the direct result of the society that produced him. The British establishment of the early 20th century demanded a rigid, impossible conformity. By aggressively criminalizing his fundamental nature, the state forced Driberg into the shadows. They taught him that survival required deception, that the law was a weapon to be evaded, and that loyalty to a state that wanted him imprisoned was a fool's errand. He took the profound vulnerabilities that society weaponized against him and turned them into armor. He utilized the immense hypocrisy of the ruling class to shield himself, knowing that the powerful would always choose to protect their own reputations over exposing a traitor in their midst. His story is not simply a thriller about Cold War espionage. It is a brutal indictment of a system that creates its own enemies. Driberg betrayed his country because his country had already betrayed him. He lived his entire life in the perilous gray margins of morality, utilizing his brilliant intellect and his absolute lack of fear to manipulate everyone around him. In the end, he escaped the justice of the courts, the wrath of the intelligence agencies, and the judgment of his peers, leaving behind a legacy that continues to baffle and disturb history. He was the ultimate outsider who conquered the inside, proving that in a world built on lies, the man who tells the most dangerous lies will always hold the power.